in the morning, realized that we face some challenges with Gradle and resolving dependencies. So at the end of the class or at the end of the lab, we could not achieve what we set out to do. So I did some digging, and what I found out is that as of um, as of Kotlin version 1.4.21 and Gradle version 1.4.1.2, Kotlin Android extensions have been deprecated. So that meant that how we used to have access to variables in code has changed with the introduction of view binding, which is a new way of having access to code. So previously, what you would do is to write find view by ID before you have access to variables, but that had changed, and so that was why we could not build our code. But I think that the exercise as I had completed the morning before was using a previously old version of the Gradle. So how I access the variables and the dependencies were using the old way. So now this is the new way of doing it. So for every new layout which you create, for example, if I create this history item layout, behind the scenes, a view binding class is generated for me. So with this view binding class, I am able to have access to the variables on the activity. So this view binding class, for example, for the payment activity, an activity payment binding is created for me. So if I want access to the variables in that layout, I first have to look for that binding class, which is generated auto generated. So I have payment history item binding, and then I now inflate that layout. Now, after having inflated the layout, I can now use that row binding variable straight away to have access to all variables or all IDs that I have declared on my layout. So, for example, for this row item layout for the list view, we have declared these IDs: test account name, we have declared account number ID, we have also declared payment date. So these are those IDs that I'm having access to them through this view binding item, right? So this is actually very new, and um, before now we did not know that this is the new way of doing stuff. So once you are able to now inflate the layout, you now assign the variables from the adapter, which this is the list view. So ideally, this list of payment info will be loaded from the database, in this case, the room database, and then that items are now binded onto the rows. So let's look at how things work from the payment history. So I went ahead to complete the exercise. Now, what we have here is the list view. Again, like I said, for this payment activity, it creates a binding class, which I use to inflate the layout. Then from the binding, I have access to the list view, which I have declared on that layout. So when the application starts, I want the application to refresh and load all the lists. So for us to load the list, we do what we call an asynchronous task. So an asynchronous task is a way to delegate activities or delegate tasks to the background, so that once it finishes, you are able to do an action based on the results. So for this asynchronous task, and loading data from the room database require that you use an asynchronous task, because it can actually take some time, and it can store the UI. So you are not allowed to actually load database on the UI thread. So that asynchronous task actually creates a new thread that executes on its own. So for that asynchronous task, we have a task that can be done in background. So for doing background, what I have is that I'm able to have access to the room dot database builder. I pass the application context the name of the database class, which is this one that we have created already, and out of that I'm able to also build database. So this line here automatically creates an SQLite database for me on my device if it doesn't exist. Now, once that is done, I'll now also get all payment info. So what does get payment info do? If we look at what we have here, it actually runs this select star from payment info. So it goes to the database, loads all the payment info that I have, and then it does the object relational mapping with this database info, and then it returns a list of database info for me. So I come back to payment history. So it gets the payment info. Now, what I need to remember is to close the database as soon as I'm able to load the data. If you leave this database connection open, it might cause your database or your database to crash, or data will be destroyed, so to speak. So always remember that you have close this database connection after you are able to load the data, or any task or any transaction that you perform on the database, remember to close it afterwards. Now this do in background returns that list of payment info. So at this point it calls this asynchronous start, calls this function, and what happens is that it has access to payment info. So in here I'm able to check if the payment info is not null and it's not empty. Now I'm now forming an adapter, or the list view adapter that we created out of the data. So I'm saying that I have the payment info list. Please use it to populate the list view. Right. So I create that adapter, and then now I assign the list view to this new adapter that I've created. Right. So without that, I'm saying that the list has no adapter and it should show a tools that no items exist. So basically, that was what we wanted to do in the labs. And again, when I click on the items, right? When I click on the item or any of the items on the list, what happens? I want to be able to show an alert dialog that will ask me whether I want to delete the list item or not. So I build the alert dialog. I set the title to be delete item, set message, save button that is actually going to show on the icons or the buttons on the alert box, right? So in here too, since I want to interact with the database, I still need an asynchronous task. Now the one thing about the asynchronous task is that if you don't need to perform any task on the UI after the asynchronous task has been completed, you don't need to write your own implementation of the post on post execute. So all that you need to do is to say that asynchronous task dot execute. Then you now specify what is actually executed, and this will be done in the background, just like you have done in this extension that we have done for the asynchronous task here. So uh, value db is equal to room. So we build the database, and then I'm saying that I want to now delete the value, the ID or that entry that I have selected on the list. So basically, when you click on it and it pops up, when you click on cancel, it goes to the database, deletes it, and then once it is deleted, I want to now refresh the list view. So by refreshing the list view, it goes back to the same own implementation of the asynchronous tasks, goes to the background, gets hold of the database, load now available list of payment infos, and then afterwards it populates the list. So let's see it in action. So I would run the code again. So let me run, right? And when I run it, okay, let me terminate the one that I was running and it runs afresh. So I have the app loaded for me now. Now what happens if I click on new payment? So I have new payment. I now want to create a new payment. So let's say that I want to create a payment to this account whose recipient is Kennedy Opoku Asare, and with the IBAN number, any IBAN number will do, right? And then I want to pay that person in a future date, so in March 2021. And maybe this person, I owe that person 7,800 euros, right? So that when that is done, I click on accept. Accept saves the data into the database. Now I go to the list view, and I have populated it here. It might seem that they are the same things repeated, but no, it's not repeated. If you check the entries very well, you realize that only the recipient name is the same, not so the entries are two different entries, right? So if I want to delete any of them, I can just click on that specific row, and it now asks, gives me the alert dialog like I explained, and it's asking me, do you want to delete the payment to this account number? If I click on delete, it actually goes to database, delete, and then refreshes the list, and the list gives me only one entry. Let me delete the other, this one too, and you realize that it says that no items yet, right? So now, how did I save the data into the database? Let me show you here. I come to payment activity, and in the same way, I use the binding, the view binding, to get access to the button without doing find view by ID, right? And I do some validation here. I check if the date format is correct. You can do extra validations here as a depending on your logic or what you want to implement. And then I create a payment info object out of the data that I have. Again, I use the binding to have access to the variables on that payment activity. So I do binding not tst recipient dot test dot string. So get me the test in this recipient component and assign it to name. So I create that payment object out of the payment info, and then once that is done, I want to now save it into the database. So basically, what I want to do is that I'm just saving the database without having any access to them or doing any activity on the UI. So what will happen is that I use straight away asynchronous start dot execute, which will execute this block of code in the background. So in the background, I do room database. So it's this code actually builds the database. If it exists, it has access to it. If not, it creates a new one. Then now I want to, through my data payment data object, I want to now insert. So what does insert does? Insert actually inserts this payment info into the database, and it knows how to do the insertion straight away with the object relational mapping. All right, so let me run the application again. So let me run again and start from afresh. And now our payment info, our menu comes. The list, there's nothing in here. Let me save a new one. So maybe I want to save a new payment to this month, right? This month, and with an IBAN number, right? And maybe in a future date, 21st April 2021, I owe this person 600 euros, and then I click on save. Right. So if I come to payment list, I see that entry there. I can add as many as I want. So basically that's about it. So this is how I was able to fix the code and get it running. So basically, it was about three things. One, the Android version, the Kotlin version that I was using in the exercise was somewhat older version, and the newer version that I created on the spot or in the class, or the new project that I created in the class was using a different version. And at that point, a lot of changes have come about. So that's how come there were issues. So this is the new version of Kotlin 1.3.21, Gradle 4.1.2. And as of this Gradle and Kotlin, the old way of doing the stuff with the Kotlin extensions or Kotlin Android extensions had been deprecated. So basically, what happens is that when you create with a new implementation, when you create any new layout like activity or menu or payment, behind the scenes there is a view binding that is generated for you. So that view binding helps you to actually have access to, for example, main activity main binding. So it helps you to have access to the binding, and right from that you are able to use the binding to access the variables without doing find view by ID. So I'm thinking that there are other additional benefits to this new way. So as I learn more, maybe I'll be able to share in the next labs. Okay, so I'll share this code for the lab, that lab that we have just completed on the Moodle, and you can take a look at it, have access to it, explore it. If you have any questions, just send us an email, and then we'll be available to answer them. Okay, thank you very much for the patience and indulging us to come back to you and fix the code. All right, see you next week. Bye.